On this episode of the podcast, I have TTT coaches Kyle Ruth and Kyle Habdo on to talk about the 3 most neglected strength training methods in CrossFit. If you're a coach or have a passion for learning the details of training and program design, we'll provide additional resources that go into these 3 specific methods more in depth. Included will be detailed information on prescriptive guidelines and on-the-floor demos. So we have our 3 methods, which will be kind of the bulk of it, but I think the bigger thing is first talking about what does the current market of CrossFit in mass, not like just the TTT community, because I think we use the methods that we're going to explain often in our own programs and in Compete, but the common person within CrossFit, if you're following a blog, taking classes, or just like going online and training, these would be the ways that you train. Talk about what the mistakes maybe or the areas you're missing from those are. And then I think that leads to why we chose our methods.
Yeah, and I think that also, as we're kind of digging into this, like there's a big difference between what someone who's following like .com or HQ is doing for their strength training and what someone who's following most of the other camps that are in the CrossFit space at this point, like what they would be doing for their strength training, and then kind of where we would intersect and say, well, these are some of the things we think are missing from that.
That's actually a good place to jump in and have this question, which is, are we going to be talking primarily about the general fitness person, someone who just wants to be healthy and look good naked, or are we going to be talking about someone who wants to compete, or a mixture of the two?
I think the methods can be very well applied to both groups of those people. Maybe as we're going through them, we can talk about how is this good for a Gen Pop GPP, and then how is this good for sport. So I think both is the answer to the question. I think the methods are applicable, but for most people in a GPP world, just training consistency is the most important. I don't.
If you don't know GPP, that's just the
it's just general
look good naked guy.
Yeah. General physical preparedness is like look good naked and be able to do things around the house and in your daily life.
Well, I think to that point as well, for GPP people, I don't want to like jump way ahead, but I think speed training, because a lot of those same people want to go and they want to play sports with their kids over the weekend and things like that. Like that's really one of the things that's missing, especially in, CrossFit training programs, or a lot of the a lot of GPP programs, they just miss speed.
Hey, motherfucker, did you just say I don't want to jump ahead, but totally jumped ahead?
I don't want to jump ahead, but I'm going to
didn't go into any of the methods that we're talking about.
Back, take it back.
So I'd say, but let's start first with like, here's how I interpret and perceive how people do it. So if you go on .com, generally speaking, if you look at the strength training, it's either there's a very small amount of strongman, which is basically just lifting up either heavy, odd objects. There is a decent amount of just straight powerlifting, like deadlift 5-5-5, or back squat 3-3-3, or bench press 3-2-1, 3-2-1, 3-2-1. Then there's a pretty heavy influence of weightlifting. It's in the CrossFit's Fitness in 100 Words. Like, don't know exactly what it says, but snatch and clean and jerk. Bergner was a big part of the growth there. Greg Everett came into the market. So I think the methods and the progressions for straight weightlifting, just percentage-based lifting in the snatch and in the clean and jerk, that's kind of the base framework that most people trying to get stronger in CrossFit do. On .com, I think the biggest error is just you don't do enough of even the methods that they're putting in there to get stronger. So the training camps, basically, like HWPO as an example, hired Amy Everett from Catalyst to be their weightlifting coach. And I think then weightlifting programs now that are more designed, more comprehensive, multiple days a week have gone into training at the more sport level. So that's how I'd kind of characterize what I see in terms of strength. And then there's a little bit of gymnastic strength too, like some strict pull-ups or L-sits or general isometrics that are done for like handstand holds.
Well, hold on.
Stuff.
So that was .com that you mainly focused there on.
Yeah.
But like just in your history of being in the community, the CrossFit community, what do you feel like most gyms and maybe most blogs how are they viewing their strength? Because I would say most people aren't doing that. Would you agree? Most people aren't doing that. Hey, you have one day and all you're doing today is 3-3-3 deadlifts. Go home, have a.
Oh, yeah. Got it. Okay. So principally, they're taking the same things. They're just expanding them out. So you would see a weightlifting program where you come in and you'd be doing 15 to 20 minutes of strength work after your warm up, which most of the time is like snatch on Monday, jerk support or overhead work on Tuesday, clean on Wednesday, a snatch or a squat snatch and an overhead squat on Friday, and a clean and jerk together on Saturday. Some distribution of general weightlifting as the strength to improve snatch, clean, and jerk. Then they go into a Metcon.
And then the next like advanced one beyond that would be all of that plus a couple of like weightlifting derivatives. So they might be doing some, pulls or snatch balance work and things like that, where they just have added some variations of the Olympic lifts. And you're right, that's like the bulk of the strength training, even though that isn't necessarily training what we would think of as like absolute strength. That really is the bulk of the strength training in the market right now.
You've coached at an affiliate and have seen, do you perceive that is accurate based on what you've seen?
I think you nailed it on the head. You got your warm up, you kind of go into some strength, you do some strength work.
Is mostly weightlifting.
Which is mostly powerlifting, weightlifting, and then you switch into your Metcon or whatever.
I was going to say, are we talking about like an affiliate, or are we talking about like an individual?
Let's talk about both or whatever y'all want to.
Yeah, because it seems to me like they definitely do powerlifting and absolute strength work. Like they definitely front squat and back squat and press of some sort. I don't think they just Olympic weightlift, especially from the gym that I came from and the things that I've seen in the market. Yeah. But again, to your point, it is like warm up 15 to 20 minutes of a strength piece, which is normally just like absolute strength work or like strength speed, I guess.
How often I perceive that there's a lot less absolute strength. Like it's more of accessory work to weightlifting. Like if you said of that 20 minutes, 5 days a week, so there's 100 minutes of total work, I'd say like from what I've observed, like 60% of that or 70% of it is weightlifting. And then the powerlifting is basically front squat, back squat. And usually they don't deadlift heavy in classes because it takes a lot of time and a lot of plates to get.
Yeah.
So it's more like clean pulls, for example.
I don't know. I'm not sure. I mean, the things that I've seen has not been in that, but that doesn't mean that's like my experience is the experience.
Well, because you were writing your training
I was
programs.
also writing.
So what you saw in the affiliate.
I'm very biased.
Yeah. I think.
Let's not get too lost in the weeds on this. We just need to come to a agreement of like, overall, our gut level feel of what's happening out there looks like blah.
To me, it's like more just like linear progression of whatever the exercise is, and you're probably doing 1 to 2 pieces of a strength thing to move into the Metcon.
And the thing we're actually trying to do here is not figure that out, but we want to figure out, well, why is that not ideal? What needs to improve there? What's the mistake? What's being missed?
Yep.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the first and most obvious one is that most people in a general class setting especially are limited from actually expressing top end power with the weightlifting movements because they're limited by their movement or their technique. So you almost like can't really get that good of a strength stimulus unless you're really technically sound. And most people, for what it's worth, their job and not being pro athletes and not being as smooth of movers as what we see from top level CrossFitters can't really get optimal strength expressions with that.
If you can't get your arms overhead to, stabilize a weight in a jerk or a snatch, safely or effectively, then the load is so limited that it's not really creating a strength adaptation in the sense that it would make you stronger in the long run. Like for a beginner, for like a true novice, like picking up a barbell repeatedly is going to make them stronger in some way, shape, or form, any way they do it. But once they've kind of gone past that point and they've moved into the kind of intermediate, which is where, your people who have been going to an affiliate for 3 to 5 years or been doing some individual stuff for 3 to 5 years, they're all there. And they're all with the Olympic lifting bias, strength development is going to be limited by technique.
Yeah. And I think some of that, I think that's a huge segment of the market. I think of people even listening, ask yourself, how often have you PR'd your Olympic lifts and by how much, given how much time you've put into it? What I've seen at least, and bringing on people that were from a class setting or non-sport setting, is that you have those really aggressive earlier gains, like a really exponential growth curve, and then it really flattens off with the Olympic lifts. And a lot of that, I think, is because you need more time technically on one side, but you also need to just get people stronger, build stronger cores, bigger front squats, bigger back squats, and the amount of time they dedicate in that type of scenario is mostly doing suboptimal tech work because the weights are too heavy to really like drill down and refine technique, but not heavy enough to actually get you strong. So using weightlifting as your primary strength tool as a non-high level mover is already like, that's check mark number one for me, saying like, it's probably not going to be the best thing to get stronger unless you're doing a lot of support work to move better in the Olympic.
Can I jump in real quick? Sorry to interrupt. I feel like what we should maybe do right now is just go ahead and make the assumption and put it on the table that what we're talking about are for people who say that they actually want to get stronger.
Yeah.
Because you might be able to break anything we're about to say down and be like, well, yeah, a lot of this is psychological and we're just trying to get, the soccer mom to actually just keep coming every week.
Yep.
And that's more important than blah, 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 So should we put on the table that what we're trying to do is this is strength talk for someone who has said that they actually want to get stronger?
Maybe. I'd add to that. It's also, if you want to look better naked, using suboptimal weights in the Olympic lifts is not going to be the best way to layer on muscle mass and improve your structural. Most people, if they want to look as good as they can naked, you maximize what your frame can hold from a muscular perspective and minimize the amount of fat that you're holding on. And there's maybe more nuance to it, but basically build muscle, lose fat. That's going to be the look good naked model. The weightlifting's not going to be the best for driving muscle mass either.
It's actually a really weightlifting itself. And
when y'all say weightlifting, you mean the snatch and clean?
Olympic style weightlifting. Yeah.
Olympic style weightlifting is probably one of the worst tools for driving hypertrophy that you could use.
Yeah.
Simply because one of the primary drivers of hypertrophy is getting muscular tension, and the impulse, the amount of time that you're generating muscular tension with a snatch or a clean and jerk it's a fraction of a second, right? Like the pull to the hip might take a total of 2 seconds, and you have this fraction of a second of maximal tension when you actually drive the bar. That's a really bad way to drive hypertrophy versus doing sets of 4 to 8 heavy loaded or moderate loaded back squats. Like that's a much better way to reach that muscular fatigue, muscular tension that's required for hypertrophy.
And if you look at the structures of weightlifters, if you look at where they build muscle mass, most of the time it's hips, legs. They're also doing accessory front squat, back squat programs that are longer time under tension, more reps. And in their upper body, where it's just a quick stabilization, there's a lot less muscle mass upstairs for most of them.
I've actually seen Greg Everett, the Catalyst weightlifting, the guy that runs Catalyst weightlifting, talk about how important it is to do accessory buys and tries for weightlifters so that they actually look like they lift weights.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I don't know how much of that was in jest, but at the same time, like he has all of that stuff built into many of the training programs that he's got.
I also want to add, I'm not advocating that you don't use Olympic lifts, because doing heavy power cleans or power snatches, or for people that can move really well, the full lifts is a great expression of power if you're strong on one end of the spectrum and you've built speed on another end of the spectrum, which most people just aren't doing. So a lot of people in the CrossFit world, you took your leap forward, but they just don't train speed, period, because the sport just by nature is more endurance. Like we talk about on the podcast all the time. It's more of a pain sport. You're more racing. You're doing 8-minute workouts, 10-minute workouts, 12-minute workouts. There's not things that are tested on like, hey, you're going to move at maximal speed for 5 seconds. Whereas in field sports, they do 40-yard dashes, vertical jumps, broad jumps, because those speed-based things are what separate in that sport. For us, our sport has swung to the spectrum more towards strength and away from speed.
Absolutely.
Are we going to jump into speed now?
I guess we can. Yeah. Well, I don't know if we jump into speed. Well, I guess we could. That's just one of the things that people are missing in their training, is that they're not doing speed training. They're not doing.
Are we jumping in?
We're jumping in.
You mean jumping into the 3 methods?
Yeah.
Okay.
So now we'll jump into the 3 methods that each y'all picked one that you thought was missing in most CrossFitters' strength work.
Yeah. So should we just introduce the 3 things before we dig into the first one?
Let's do that.
So the first one, is it going to be plyometrics for speed? Is that going to be the one that you thought? Okay. So by nature of what we just talked about, most people are missing speed training. And when we say speed training, like maximal velocity, full sprint, maximal jumps, even if you're doing jumps, it's like this high for double unders for hundreds of reps, or it's a 20-inch box or a 24-inch box for most people where you're pulling your knees up.
Yeah, you're not really doing a 20-inch vertical jump each time you do a 20-inch box jump. You're really only jumping a few inches off the floor. In CrossFit, you're really jumping the minimum number of inches possible and
to keep it efficient.
Yeah, to keep it efficient and lifting your feet up.
Okay, sorry. Continue.
Okay, so speed training, and the method that we're going to talk to train speeds is actually doing plyometrics, because I think it's the easiest, lowest barrier to entry that beginners, intermediates, advanced could start to do at an easy level. The second would be what we're calling overcoming isometrics, which we'll explain what that means, but in depth, but basically maximally contracting against something that doesn't move. Normally you do a front squat and you're contracting and you're lowering it and you're raising it and you're moving.
Like when you're constipated.
Exactly. Yeah, that.
And it doesn't move.
Yeah. So overcoming isometrics would be the second one. And I think when we get to each one, we can explain how it helps or how it solves those problems we talked about.
Yeah.
And then the third one was chains and bands, which is basically changing the way that you contract in terms of needing to accelerate through ranges of motion that you get stuck in. So we'll jump into where Kyle jumped us earlier with plyometrics, and you could lead it off, Habdo. This was actually Habdo's.
Wait, who picked speed?
I did. Habdo.
Yeah, okay, let me stop you right there then. I think the first thing when we jump into this is like you say speed, and I think most people's brains going to be like, we do lots of stuff for speed. So really jump in, and how are you defining that?
I would argue that we do nothing for speed, almost ever. I don't think. I mean, even in the individual training athlete, I don't know how.
According to how you're defining it.
Yeah,
I'm saying I think a lot of people probably hear that and think,
because I move fast.
Yeah, I move
put
fast.
a clock on.
So what are they missing here?
Yeah, so speed is your ability to produce a max velocity, I guess, or a max contraction, but you're doing it with maximal recovery, and it's not loaded. I think I have to make that sure that's caveats put there, because you could also have max velocity with max load, but there's almost no load, or there is no load when you're doing it, and sometimes you're using bands to offload your body weight. So we could get down the rabbit hole of that. But plyometrics are, I think, the easiest introduction into speed training. And I think when people think plyometrics, all they think is box jumps. I think, would that be wrong?
Yeah, box jumps or double unders. I'd say those would be the plyometric things.
Is box jump a plyometric? I feel I see arguments that it is and it isn't.
How you do the box jump will define it, and also. So most speed is going to be measured in, let's just say less than 5 seconds. If you start to extend beyond 5 seconds and you start doing repeated speed efforts, people get slower. Right. So if you are doing, let's say, I would say, if I'm going to try to pose the argument from where Chris comes, because let's say he did 100-meter dash on the minute for 10 minutes. That's a common workout that I would see in CrossFit that is, quote unquote, training speed. But you're sprinting. Most people, if they're sprinting, they know they're going to do 10 of them, and they know that it's going to take, let's say, 15 to 20 seconds. So they're going to get 45 to 40 seconds of total rest between. They know that they're going to blow up their whole system by the end. They'll basically be walking or slow jogging by the time it comes. So by nature of doing your workout in that type of a structure, you automatically lower the amount of speed that you put out and lower the nerve muscle impulse, and you try to make it more endurance based. So most of the time people are doing speed training, quote unquote, they're actually doing speed endurance training.
Yeah, and that stimulus, that 10 by 100s that you just referred to, especially on that short of a clock, is not going to make someone who's well-trained faster. What it's going to do is it's going to create a speed endurance adaptation where they're getting better at sustaining this sub-maximal speed, but it's not going to Kyle's point, talking about how people don't train speed, it's not going to fundamentally make them faster, which is what we're talking about.
Okay, that's a good point, Kyle. So before you go into plyometrics, was this the avenue you picked to train speed that we're going to talk about on this podcast? Tell me real quick, if I don't have that, what is the problem? Like you say, you look out there, people aren't doing this. If I'm that athlete and I'm not doing plyometrics or I'm not doing my speed work, what am I going to be missing? Where am I going to feel this at some point?
Yeah, so in order to create power, or the category of power, you need both strength and speed. We are pretty good at training strength, And then that leads us into power, which kind of helps, right?
Power is like weightlifting. People want to get better at weightlifting. So
weightlifting, power,
I think power
snatches. Something of that in that nature. Like we're really good at doing strength work, but we're really not great at doing the speed side of it. So we're missing one of like the fundamental components in order to create power or to create a better power clean and better power snatch. So when we go to like, if we don't train speed, you're missing one of the components. So just you're not being as powerful as you could be.
Yeah, I think I would say that the thing most people are missing if they train that is elasticity. If they don't train that is elasticity. Like a lot of athleticism is your ability to get into your end range and get out of it really quick. When you watch the best weightlifters in the world, they like catch the bottom of their, I know it's heavy, but they catch in the bottom of the clean, and most of the time they hit the bottom and then they're right back out, or they go to dip and change direction in the jerk, and they're so fast in the change of direction that you see the bar bend down. Now, some of those people that you see at the world-class weightlifting level are doing plyometrics. You watch them do max vertical or max box jump height with long rests in between, and they're trained to be athletic. What happens in our CrossFit versions of those weightlifting programs is that you're time constrained, and then you strip out the other stuff. So you do all barbell. So I think you miss elasticity, like your ability to actually change direction quickly, and you miss tendon stiffness and development that allows you to absorb eccentric loading quickly. Like when you're trying to catch a clean or catch a snatch, you're basically trying to slow down a weight that is moving with gravity against you really fast without letting your midline crush and being able to change direction quickly. So when people don't train fast, they often miss that. So you watch them lift and it's like very grindy and powerlifting or strongman-y, and they don't have this like athletic rebound effect in their tendons.
We've actually, to kind of support this argument, we've actually run vertical jump testing on athletes when they come in for camps here. And one of the things that we find is there's a really high correlation between someone having a very high vertical jump, which is a proxy for speed, and their power clean. Yeah. And in general, the higher someone's vertical jump, the higher their power clean is going to be relative to a full clean or squat clean, and relative to the other athletes in the sport. So it's like, we're not just talking about like when Habdo says, you know, speed is one of the foundational qualities required for power. It's speed and strength. We can literally observe that people that have more speed actually produce more power in a power clean. It's not just like theoretical, it's applied as well.
Yeah, and applied also in the context of the sport. So you see the workout, was quarterfinal workout number 3, the workout with like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 of clean and jerks with 275 and high box jumps. Yeah. A lot of people in that workout by round 3, 2, 1, they weren't able to power clean anymore, and they had to go down into a squat, rely on technique and rely on leg strength to get up, because they don't have more so like speed endurance to be able to keep it up. But having higher top end speed generally will drive your power clean up higher relative to your actual clean. And then it allows you in Metcons not to have to rely on really slow cleans, because cleans where you have to squat clean relative to power clean take more time.
Way more.
And they also take more energy because you're under so much time under tension. So having your speed dialed in, especially from a hip perspective in CrossFit, allows you to sustain box jumps, heavy power cleans, things where even dynamic things like muscle ups where you need a really explosive hip drive up against the bar. Having speed just translates into the rest of the sport really well. It's the best athletes in the sport are just faster, right? Like they're just faster people. Kyle, we had him demo plyometrics, and I'm like, oh, just do a little jump. He jumps and he's 40 inches off the ground. He also spent how many years doing plyos for swimming and jumping off? 5+ years?
Probably closer to 10.
Yeah, so he doesn't really need to train speed, but he's already faster than most people, and I think that's true. Like Travis is at least when we tested it, I think he was a 34-inch vertical without much vert training. We do like speed work probably 1 or 2 days a week because we're trying to balance it with everything else. So it definitely plays a role in development of your ability in the sport also.
Well, I think we've sold the idea that speed training is probably very important. And a lot of the people who are listening, especially people who are more endurance, they tend to be more endurance-based CrossFitters who struggle to get strong. Like this is really one of the things that they should be doing. But like, what are plyometrics?
Well, why'd you just say that? Why'd you just say that? Why did you focus in on the endurance people?
Well, because if you tested the vertical jump of most of the people who tend to be really good at endurance sport, they tend to have the lowest vertical jump. And there's a whole bunch of physiological reasons for that. Like, example, the distribution of fast twitch and slow twitch muscle fibers. Like, they tend to have more slow twitch than, athletes who have higher vertical jumps, but there's not a direct correlation for that. And it's trainable, right? If you train plyometrics, people can improve their speed and
You're
power.
just saying more often than not, the endurance athlete needs this.
Yeah, if you were a collegiate football player, you probably gravitated into that sport because you were powerful and had speed already. Like your
nervous system's kind of wired for it.
Yes. And so whether or not you're going to benefit a ton from doing a bunch of plyometric work to improve your Olympic lifts is probably very debatable. But if you are someone who gravitated towards more endurance-based sports when you were younger or didn't play sports, right? Like, there's a good chance that doing plyometric and speed training is going to improve your power potential.
Yeah. Endurance athletes too are just naturally slower. I mean, the reality is even fast CrossFitters like Dan Bailey, when he was crushing the game sprints and he had his previous sprinting background, was not a fast, like he wasn't winning 100-meter dashes on a national level. He was a good runner, but not like a top end speed. And he was like way faster than everybody else. So by nature, as you go more swinging into the endurance, your body is most likely going to be a little bit slower. And even within our little spectrum of CrossFit, the slower athletes are going to need to, if they want to be balanced, prioritize building speed. And you don't build speed by just building strength. So like if you're a lot of the people that are not super fast and explosive that are enduring also are a little bit weaker. Like they need to build their front squat, their back squat. And there's a lot of that testing in the sport. So they do a lot of loaded stuff, but they just don't do a lot of speed training.
So you're saying there's a need for speed?
There he is. I knew he was going there.
I love it.
Okay. So that's kind of the why. What about the how?
Yeah, plyometrics. So it's the easy way.
That's just one of your examples.
It's just one of the examples. There's, I think we have 4 different examples, if I remember correctly, in the manual, or even in the strength course itself. But plyometrics, I think, are just an easy in for people because it's just you can literally do them anywhere. Yeah. So it's like you got pogos, bounds, leaps, hops. I think those are like the 4 big categories, and then it depends on how you perform them and like what way you perform them. But you can have longer ground contact time, shorter ground contact time. You could have repeats, single bounds. And all those things will emphasize different parts of the speed continuum and the adaptations that then come onto your body, like the structural adaptations, and then maybe some of the neurological adaptations as well. But they all are helping you produce speed. And that's necessary for someone who just doesn't play with or like doesn't have that adaptation already.
Yeah. And within that, I think it's also about, so those are the movements. And you, like one of the things you said, pogos, bounds.
Yep.
So most people would think like, well, a double under is a pogo jump because you are jumping up and down, or repeated box jumps is repeated bounds. But it's also about the rest recovery profiles of how you do those exercises. You cannot do a minute straight of box jumps, rest 1 minute, and expect that is going to create a plyometric stimulus on the body. It's really about treating it like strength work. You're doing 1 to 5 jumps at max effort, and then you're resting 2 minutes, and you're repeating that. For CrossFit minds, that can be so hard. They're just like, oh, I don't feel like I'm doing anything. I could do this all day. I could jump all day. However, if you're trying to get faster, those incremental, even if it's 1% higher, 1 inch higher that you can jump, compounded over a session over 25 jumps means you're expressing so much more neural drive in the session, and you're able to build on that over time. Yep. So with plyometrics, it's, I think, resting more is the key thing that most people would do. Even if you're doing your normal box jumps, is resting more and having the intention of maximal explosion. So if you're doing box jumps, you jump with a maximal vertical displacement, so you're getting as high off the ground as you possibly can and land softly. Almost everyone I would talk to in CrossFit, if you said, okay, do that in Kelly, which is, I think, is Kelly the
30.
one with
30? 5 rounds of 30.
Yeah, 5 rounds, 800, 30 box jumps, 30 wall balls.
Yeah.
If you did that, after round 1, your legs would be exploded, right? So everyone doesn't really plyometrically jump.
Yeah, I think the problem with plyometrics in CrossFit is that they are not meant to improve maximal speed.
Yeah, they're not true plyometrics.
They're not. That's not the intention. Like you mentioned double unders. And if you think about your goal with a double under is to be as efficient as possible, to make it so that you have the least cardiovascular tax possible, which means that your jump should be as low as possible for the rope to spin under your feet 2 times. Yeah. Like that's your intention with the double under is to stay as low as possible. But when you're doing pogo with the intention of improving, maximal force production or maximal speed production, your intention needs to be to get as high as possible with every single one. So if you were to do that in a CrossFit workout, right? So say it's a 20-inch box and you're doing a 30-inch vertical every time you land on the box, like A, it's going to take a long time because that's going to take a lot longer. And B, the amount of fatigue that's going to accumulate across that workout it makes the workout not possible, right? So it's like the intention of the session is the thing that's going to determine the adaptation that you get.
I think actually I want to let the cat out of the bag right here real quick and let everybody listening know that each method that they're going to talk about, I convince them to put a site together that will have actual pieces from the course, right? So when we're talking about speed, you're just going to give them the speed portion. They can go in and really dive in and see exactly what the course will say. So, and the reason I wanted to bring that up and interrupt was we're going to keep talking about it, but just in case you're like, man, I'm kind of lost in the weeds, like something that we're going to give you at the end of this is something where you could dive in and straight learn it as we teach it in the course. We'll do that for all 3 methods. So if at any point you're like, oh my God, this is overwhelming, or I need to take notes, chill out.
Yeah.
I mean, we're going to just give you the course or pieces of the course.
Yeah. The reality is this is decades of experience, textbook information, like PT school, continual learning. And we're trying to condense and speak it in a 1 hour, 90-minute podcast. Is very hard to do. So what we did with the course was try to build it very systematic to teach you, okay, this is the category. Here's the method in the category. Here's how many reps. Here's how many sets. Here's the rest time. And we broke down the mechanics. I think for purposes of this talk, we're just kind of talking a little bit more theoretical, and we're talking about concepts that would require us like blowing out and going a little bit more.
And that's how conversations work. You kind of go all over the place. Whereas perfect word, systematic. It's like, if you just want how to think about this with no frills, that's what y'all put
and
together.
how to prescribe it, like how to understand how to prescribe it. To tie this back, I'm guessing people who watch this, there's a good amount in one-on-one programming or in compete. When we put in the sessions, like Mike in his strength sessions or Brandon when he's writing the plyometrics, and there's seated box jumps or there's depth drops into vertical jumps, and you do 3 reps, rest 2 minutes before moving back to a strength piece, you'll notice that in all of those sessions, there's an intention, right? Like intention, target, feel. And Brandon creates a video. The explanation of how to do the jumping and how to think about the jumping is actually part of making the jumping effective at building your speed. If you're not going in with the intention of maximal effort contractions, then you don't actually express maximal speed. Most people who are able to be fast are quite intense and able to bring that maximal velocity intention into each contraction. So I just kind of wanted to throw that out there so that people could draw the parallels and maybe understand now. They've probably done them for months, and you go through an off-season cycle and you're like, doing these jumps 1 day a week or 2 days a week for 12 straight weeks. This can maybe give them a little bit more of the why, like that's what I was doing and why it's in the training program.
I think it's really common for people when things like that, especially like seated box jumps, that's such a good example, are in a training program. They tend to approach them at like 90% effort because it's prep. In their mind, they're prepping for the thing that really matters, the squatting. But it turns out, like Kyle has brought up, that this is like, so for a lot of people in the sport, this is like the training. Yeah. You need this plus the heavy strength work in order to be able to express this stuff and be more successful in power generation.
Yeah. I just wanted to say before we move on, like it's intentional. Like you have to be intentional about the way that you execute the exercise. And I think the biggest mistake that I see from people is not resting long enough. Yeah. They look at like that 2 minute rest, that 3 minute rest, and they're like, I don't even feel tired.
I'm ready.
Yeah, I'm ready to go.
It probably has a lot to do with them not valuing why they're doing it.
For sure.
You know, like, so
Agreed.
maybe hopefully hearing this, you kind of put it together and now you have a stronger why to wait out the rest and not be bored.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you are one of those people that's too impatient and doesn't want to do that, first you're making that bargain with yourself, but then you're probably going to get less speed adaptations, but you'd be better off doing something else with your time. Like plyometrics without the intention of being maximal effort are a little bit of a waste of time. But if you do them properly and you put the right intention into it and you do that consistently and progress it the same way you progress your weightlifting, I've found that it'll help you gain faster in the Olympic lifts. And I think it helps people express their power for longer in their training. If people are just doing weightlifting, just my own personal observations over time, they end up peaking quickly. And then as they get older, they start to lose it a lot because I think speed deteriorates with age faster than strength. And that's been proven. Like powerlifting world records are oftentimes set in like the 40s, whereas like world-class sprinters are done in their late 20s and weightlifters are a lot of times done in their, late 20s, early 30s. So training speed, especially for the masters athlete, is very, very, very helpful.
I've started to see my vertical jump, which was like a point of pride for me, start to deteriorate. Around early 30s, I tested at 39 inches, and that's a pretty
very high,
damn good vertical jump, and I was very proud of that.
Couldn't get 40.
Just, I know, Chris. That was with no I was training CrossFit with no power training, right?
No excuses.
No
excuses.
Okay. No, I was playing in the garage with my kids, and we were having them do the sticky note vertical jump, and I couldn't get over 33. And I set a 5K.
What happened?
I set a 5K PR the day before, so I was clearly dampened, a little bit. But I was just like, "Damn, dude, that's like a huge drop. If that's
a big percentage.
That's a huge drop off for it." But they were like, my kids were like, "Wow,
you jump so high!"
Yeah, I'm like, "Yeah, if you only could really see what
what I used to be back in the day,
back in my day."
Before we move to the next one, did any of y'all read Louie Simmons' Explosive Strength for Jumping book?
No, I only read Westside Book of Methods.
Okay. Well, that book comes with a DVD, and just a little side note, that DVD is hilarious because God bless Louie, RIP to the GOAT, but he's just an older dude, right? And he's doing these videos, right? And they're basically movement demos. So it'll be like a depth jump, right? So you're jumping from one box and then jumping onto the other. And he has his little demo buddy. I forget his name, but let's say it's David. He'll be looking straight at the camera. He'll go like, "All right, we're going to do depth jumps for a 20-inch box. David does it. David gets the top. He finishes. He looks back at the camera. He goes, "Thank you, David." And then it just goes to the next one. But the next one is on a 24-inch box. It is the same shit. And they don't have any kind of creative editing to just, run it all together. It's just like, "All right, depth jumps, 24-inch box. David does the rep. David finishes. Thank you, David." And this goes on for the whole book. And you can imagine each one, regular box jumps now. And God bless them.
Yeah. The Westside Book of Methods was...
I was telling Habdo, I reread that for writing. We should talk about bands and chains.
Yeah,
because
let's just go into the
Are we
next
talking
one.
about accommodating resistance now?
Yeah. I think that's where we're going.
Habdo got excited.
Oh, yes.
Big words.
I love big words.
When we went to write the methods section for bands and chains for accommodating resistance.
Hold on. Accommodating resistance and bands and chains is the second method that CrossFitters are generally missing or oftentimes missing. Now, I'll caveat that because Louie and Westside did kind of get in with CrossFit and created CrossFit Conjugate and competed for a little while. So there's a small contingent of people within the CrossFit market that does effectively or maybe not effectively, but they use bands and chains in training. But we're talking about en masse. Most people are not doing it. And I think the biggest reason why is just setup.
Hold on, I got to say my favorite video I've ever made.
I was about to say,
just Google CTB cam, Louie Simmons, and that video will pop up. It's banded cleans. That's my favorite video I've ever made. It's with Alex Macklin and Louie Simmons.
Who's doing the banded cleans?
Alex.
Macklin? Oh, okay. I remember seeing that video.
There's another one where Mike's doing it. So I did two, but that's not my favorite one.
Oh, maybe that's
a good
the one
one.
I
you
saw.
can watch that too. But banded cleans, with Alex Macklin. Just CTB cam, Louie Simmons will pop up.
Yeah, there's a lot of people that say that bands and chains should not be done with the Olympic list. I think I'm on that, but I don't think we need to go into that.
I was gonna say I've never seen bands and chains used except for obviously from Westside, watching Westside videos, and from that video that you're talking about. And of course, because I'm an idiot, I went and did with the bands.
Did you have the proper setup?
I was at a college gym that had a really nice setup, so I was able to actually set it up well. But like, I was that idiot that was like, "Oh, this looks cool. I got to go try this."
Nice. Did you PR?
No.
To that point, I think there probably is a lot of application for the weightlifting derivatives.
Yes.
Right? Pulls, push presses,
Yeah.
things like that with bands and chains.
Yeah, but just actual cleans.
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
But I think part of it is that, you talked about how Louie had brought some of it into CrossFit. Bands and chains went through their hype cycle, right?
Yeah.
Like they had reached their peak in like early, I guess it would have been like around 2008, 2009 was like peak bands and chains, where it was the thing that was talked about in the trading market. And then everyone started hating on it, right? Like every hype cycle works. And the reality is just like every other thing that goes through its hype cycles. And now all of us have been coaching long enough to now see things that were like super popular fall out of popularity and then come back and everyone's like, "Oh, this again." And I'm like,
Yeah.
"Oh yeah, I remember we never stopped using it because." So like bands and chains fall into that category.
Yeah. One hype cycle example of that is Charles Poliquin had basically a structural balance concept. And within that, one of the things he said was often very undertrained was the VMO and getting the knee to track over the toe. He had this thing called Poliquin step ups and Peterson step ups. And it was back then there wasn't like YouTube. So nothing went quote unquote viral, but information spread through the strength and conditioning community really fast all the time. So I remember back in like, I don't know, late 2000s ish. And when I was taking the Poliquin courses, the BioSig courses, Poliquin step ups, Peterson step ups, training your VMO, like it was literally like the craze. Then people started realizing like, well, there's more to it. You need more balance training. Like that's not going to solve all the problems, blah, 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 blah. Everyone realizes it's not a magic pill. They fall off the hype cycle, find something else to be the magic pill. And then it came back with knees over toes. And like, he does credit a lot of the stuff to talking about Peterson step ups and Poliquin step ups, but it just like rode the hype cycle again. So that's what we're talking about when we say hype cycles, like these fads within training. They get really popular and then they kind of explode.
And it's probably a natural thing, right? We all operate on
excitement of novelty.
Once you've been in the game long enough, you can see it for what it is. But it's kind of fun to ride a hype cycle because why not?
Yeah, and try new things. I go through. I call them like little mini training blocks where I just prioritize something, or recently I've been trying something new. So I did table tennis where I went and I got table tennis lessons once or twice a week for 12 straight weeks. Then I did this dance project with Mike Needleman for 12 weeks. So I think that same concept that I do through exploring movement, a lot of people do through strength training. They're like, "Oh, I want to get stronger. This thing came out. I'm going to try it. I'm going to jump on it." But anyway, that's what a hype cycle is. Back to, why do you think, or why did you say specifically that you thought that was the strength training tool or method that people are missing in CrossFit, and how would it help them get better?
So I think the reason I think this is the right thing to talk about next, the bands and chains, is because it piggybacks off of the speed work. Like the idea of using bands and chains is to train the ability to either maintain speed out of the hole in like a squat, or to generate better rate of force development in a deadlift or a pull. Like that really is the idea behind using bands and chains. So like you can do your plyometric work and you can do your absolute strength work. So you do your box jumps and you do your heavy squats. But if you're trying to turn that into power, you need to be able to learn to utilize heavy loads at speed. And the thing that bands and chains really allow you to do is to use loads that are like, 60 to 70 to 75% of your 1RM and move them fast. And really, we dug into some of the research on this, and like a lot of the research suggests that kind of range, that 55 to 70% range, is where maximal human power generation falls. And so this allows you to take something like a band and drive as hard as you can out of the hole and try and maintain speed and maintain that speed generation all the way to the top, right through your sticking point. And I think that's one of the problems that we see with just like you do the two ends, right? Ends to middle style training, where you're training speed on one end of the spectrum and absolute strength on the other end of the spectrum, but you don't ever do anything to put them together in the middle. This is where I kind of think the middle is. And that's why I think it's such a valuable tool. It allows people to kind of bridge the gap between their speed training, between their absolute strength training, mash it together into something that they can use in sport.
Yeah, I find that there's two very common practical things that this would develop in sport where I see sticking points really crush people. The first would be repeat front-loaded squat cleans or front squats, like a workout that's 21, 15, 9, heavy or moderate front squat and bar muscle up. And the other would be high-volume strict handstand push-up. For most people in those settings, maybe in the earlier sets, they're able to maintain speed through the motion. So the time under tension, under load is not that bad for them. But as people start to get tired, they start to get to those sticking points. And then as a result of getting into those sticking points, then they start to lose body posture. Happens all the time in strict handstand push-ups. People bounce off the floor, they go to press, they get stuck. Because they're stuck, they arch their back and try to get their pec involved, and they fall off the wall, get no reps, or
maybe get 2 more reps like that and then burn out.
Yeah. Or same thing with fronts, like repeat front squats. You go to squat, you're kind of fast, all of a sudden you get a little bit more tired and you don't have the ability to generate speed and velocity under the load, and your midline breaks and the weight starts to move forward and pull you. Now, some of getting that better in a Metcon format is doing Metcons and building endurance in it. But applying the chains or the bands allows you to use a lighter weight at the bottom. So let's say you have chains on, and what they're effectively doing when you're at the top standing up is they're pulling you down. They're stretched out like a big rubber band. So it's adding a lot of weight. But as you start to go down and as you start to squat, the effective weight that you're squatting is actually getting lighter. So what it allows you to do when you are standing at the top, let's say you're holding 300 pounds with the weight plus the bar. However, when you start to lower the weight and you start to shorten the actual tension on the band, at the bottom, you might only be at 200 pounds. So you're able to turn around and change direction at a much faster speed.
And use your speed that you've developed with your plyometrics.
Because the weight is lighter. Then as you're squatting up, the weight is getting heavier on you. So the only way that you can maintain the ability to continue pressing through that is if you maintain your speed and acceleration up against the increasing weight. So by changing that, what's called the force curve, and basically changing where the weight's heavy and how it's getting heavier as you're doing it, you're learning how to express speed better under load. Now, a lot of people don't set them up right, or they don't really have ways to track and measure them, or they just put them on kind of sloppy and do it one day a week, and they don't do it consistently and repeatedly for like week after week after week. We've run some cycles in Compete, and some of the feedback is like people don't have them. They don't have a good setup. So I can understand why many CrossFitters don't use it. However, if you can put the time into finding how to set them up effectively in your gym and use them regularly, I find that they can pay huge strength gains, and also they can add some variance to people's training. Like, you go through weightlifting training programs for 3-5 years, a lot of people are going to plateau. They need new methods to actually get stronger because they've already adapted to a lot of the stuff that they've done. One
of the things that Habdo and I talked about when we were writing the section on bands and chains is the fact that depending on the setup that you use, like we talked a lot about a reverse band setup where the bands are actually hooked up above, right? And then you bring them down and they make it so that the bar is lightest in the bottom, but in a different way, right? They're providing assistance out of the bottom. With this, what it's allowing you to do is like you unrack, say your 1RM back squat's 400 pounds and you walk out and you've got say 450 pounds on the bar at the top. And so you can stand there with 450 pounds on your back and you can go through the eccentric. And as you drop into it, the bands start to assist more and more and more. So the weight goes now below your 1RM in the bottom. You generate that speed. And then again, your goal is to maintain speed through your sticking point. You get back up to your sticking point and you probably have about 400 pounds, your 1RM at your sticking point, and allows you over time to slowly overload that sticking point and build strength exactly where you get stuck every time you do a back squat.
Yeah, with your 1RM weights, right? Like you manipulate the force curve so you can actually squat 400 pounds in that situation for multiple reps, whereas without them, you couldn't.
Yeah. And I've found that to be for those more endurance based athletes that, you know, they struggle to use their speed. I've found for them that using a reverse band setup is one of the most effective tools that I've come up with for breaking through strength plateaus. And that's including, you know, they've gone through hatch cycles and 5-3-1s and things like that. And, you know, maybe they add 5 pounds over the course of 12 weeks. And then we do a reverse band setup for 4 weeks and they hit a 10-pound PR. It's like, it's forcing loading progression on the body, and the body is adapting to it because they're doing it over and over and over. It really does give you access to something that you can't do elsewhere.
Yeah, without just a straight barbell.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing though is the setup and the execution of actually setting up the reverse band or the bands and the chains in a bands, because we've talked about this. It's like, and you could go into any CrossFit gym, they're always stretched out because people are doing like strict pull-ups or attempting to do strict pull-ups, or they're doing
kipping pull-ups,
with the bands, or they're doing like their like lat stretch or whatnot. So like our suggestion is, if you are going to try to do bands, like buy your own set of bands and just keep it like in your gym bag. Yeah. And then if you're going to do the reverse band setup, you have to make sure that you have the rig necessary in order to do it, because that really depends. Like if you don't have two bars that are on an even surface or an even playing field, like, and they're staggered, it's just never going to work.
Yeah,
so you
can't
have to
set it up.
Yeah. So it's like,
and I think this is probably why this whole conversation gets skipped, is because it's such a headache. And am I doing it right? And do I have the space? Am I that asshole in the way?
Yeah. So this one we talked about earlier, the speed being good potentially, or the methods of weightlifting not being good for GPP versus athletes. I think with the chains and bands, this one is more specifically when we're talking about for performance-driven athletes.
Absolutely.
Like you want to get your PRs up, this is a method that can help it. This would be much more for intermediate and advanced-based athletes. If you're trying to look good naked and just generally squat, using this, I think, would just be overcomplicated thing. All right, so can that lead us into the third one?
I was about to say, what's the third one?
All right, so I'm going to jump onto what Kyle was talking about. He's saying on one side we have speed, and on one side we have like maximal strength. So deadlift on one side and box jump on the other side. Both are like hip-driven strength components, but one of them is your body weight at maximal velocity, and the other one is at maximal load. What we have in between is kind of that spectrum. People would call it the strength-speed spectrum, where you have speed, strength, and strength, speed. We kind of bundled that into power in the course. And on that strength side, most of the time in a CrossFit setting, people are training either back squat, front squat, or strict press or deadlift. Those are
and bench press.
Oh, and bench press. Bench press became much more of a common thing when they put Linda in the semifinals. But those would be the primary tools for driving strength. What I find the problem in a CrossFit setting is like, if you listen to world-class powerlifters, they always talk about the deadlift being the most neurologically taxing thing that you can do. When they pull a heavy deadlift, it's like 2 weeks before they're recovered and ready to do it again. And at Rogue this year, they did that deadlift ladder workout, and on Sunday those athletes were wrecked. I think all of them would say, if you went and asked, like, hey, we're going to do that deadlift ladder, and then we're going to do the same thing with a power clean or something that's lighter, or the heavy sandbag at the games, I'm pretty sure every single one of the people in the field would say that from a structural and nervous system perspective, that the repeat deadlifts were the ones that crushed them the most. What that ends up meaning is that it's very hard to do a lot of peak strength work and CrossFit at the same time, because your nervous system's getting smashed by going heavy. It's much higher likelihood of injury, so you have to be resting and recovering. So my reason for choosing overcoming isometrics, which we'll explain, is that you can do that max effort strength stuff with a little bit less mechanical breakdown and structural breakdown. So when you go into your sport phases where you're doing a lot of metcons, you can keep training that maximal strength side of the spectrum and not have to lower your overall training volume. So I find that it's very good for sport performance strength gains, and also rehabbing chronic tendon issues. Like if somebody's trying to get their squat up, and every time you start adding squat, their knees start to bother them, they might not be able to do a high volume squat cycle, but they might be able to do 10 sets of 7-second max effort pin front squats where you do some at the bottom position, some at the mid position, some at the top position, and they maintain strength gains while they're rehabbing.
Or all of them at their sticking point, because you know that that's their weakest point in the lift.
Yeah.
I mean, that would be a great way to address it. So we haven't addressed what exactly overcoming isometrics are. Who wants to tackle that?
I mean, we talked about it slightly in the beginning of this podcast, but I mean, you want to?
Yeah. So there's basically, isometric is basically holding muscle tension and not moving. So a type of isometric, which would not be an overcoming isometric, would be holding a handstand or holding a plank or holding onto a weight and not moving. That is done a little bit more frequently in CrossFit, I think mostly through the gymnastics or strongman component, that there's some yielding isometrics in training. Overcoming isometrics would be, as an example, I have the J hooks on the bar on my rig. I turn them upside down so the J cups are facing downward. I go and I put the bar into a front rack and I get underneath the J hooks and I go and I push and contract against the J hooks. And basically I'm trying to get to the mindset that I'm trying to rip the rig and the J hooks off the ground and contract at maximal effort. Like I'm trying to contract as if I was having a 1 rep max front squat in that scenario. With an overcoming isometric, though, you're pushing against something that will not move. So you're not going to be able to push against and create any motion. So you're not going to have any eccentric muscle damage. You're not going to have any movement when you're doing it. You're only creating intra-abdominal pressure and like the tension required for maximal strength.
And a lot of nervous system
I was going to say a
fatigue.
lot of like neurological drive there.
Yes.
It's almost a way to isolate the nervous system. You know, like you pull a heavy deadlift and you're stimulating the nervous system and you're using so much of the so much skeletal muscle.
Yeah, your back's going to get sore,
Yes.
your hamstrings.
And you're making it move, right? You're making the skeletal muscle move, which is different than doing an isometric contraction where it's just locked in place. And it's almost, I don't want to say it's isolating the nervous system because
I was going to say the muscles are still working. They're still doing something.
Yeah, but we're going to get scientific people like, actually.
Yeah, my caveat there is that like it's kind of like isolating the nervous system in that sense. And that's one of the things that I've found that works so well, like a mid-thigh clean pull isometric. It's actually, I think, a really popular thing in NFL training for like the hang power clean and things like that, where you same setup, right? You're pulling against safety squat bars or something like that are just fixed. And you're pulling at maximal effort right where you would initiate the second, the end of the second pull in a clean.
Yeah.
And I think things like that, or setting it up at your sticking point in a shoulder press, I found to be for people.
Love it.
Yes. Pin presses at your sticking point, like forehead level in a shoulder press, such an effective tool for getting people to break through strength plateaus.
Yeah. Shout out to Adam Rogers for leading the charge on the quarantine machine. So during COVID, he found somebody that created this platform, which is basically a wooden platform that you tie chains to, and then you put a metal rod into it. And during that period of time, we were all home all the time. The gyms were closed. We created a landing page called the Quarantine Machine and this whole video of how to create it and how to set it up and how much it costs.
Quarantine Machine, the first video that pops up, at least for me, is that
video. Yeah. So you can watch that. I used isometrics all through COVID as a way to maintain strength, but that was really one of the points of time where I realized like, oh, this is one of the methods that I think is effective for both athletes and GPP people.
Yes.
Because the reality is like GPP trainees, they don't, or this is my personal opinion, I don't think that most GPP people should take the risk of building to 1 rep max deadlifts and 1 rep max deadlifts, front squats and back squats often. Partially because they don't practice that specific movement all the time. They don't really need to take the injury risk. In order to build muscle mass, you don't really need to be at true 1 rep maxes. So I think that sub-maximal training, kind of like maybe a 5-3-1 principle, like where you're always operating at 90% of your 1 rep maxes as your max, even though you could do more than that. I think those are just safer, more effective ways to train. I think if you are going to be a GPP person that's training 1 1RMs and truly testing them, you should be training 5 days a week or 3 to 5 days a week, and then doing your accessory work. And you're more specifically focused on a little bit more performance. Like you're a GPP athlete, but you also love competing and think of it that way. Isometrics are a way to be able to train that peak strength with a little bit less of the risk. It's not as measurable. It might not be as fun, but you can set it up very easily and you can make people stronger and get that strength adaptation easier. So I like this one. Reason why I chose it, CrossFitters get injured or get pattern overload injuries pretty often. So this could be a quick way to go into maintenance. Sticking point training, like getting through the sticking point of a handstand push-up, getting more explosive in the jerk dip to change direction and being in a partial dip and pushing up against the bar. So it has a really good transfer of saving people's joints and building top-end strength and breaking through power plateaus also, because we talked about power is also one component strength and one component speed. So this is a way to get the strength without making you too tired and impacting your weightlifting progressions.
Yeah, I think the only thing that I think we maybe talked about or didn't talk about was just like the volume requirement of CrossFit and like how we can use and overcoming isometrics to maintain strength while you're in a cycle of really high CrossFit, like Metcons or in preparation for a competition.
Yeah, I didn't say that.
I don't know. Did
I maybe
I think
thought
you
that.
you touched on how it allows you to reduce mechanical loading.
Yeah.
Dive in.
Across.
What is he talking about?
Yeah, so like if you just add up all the reps in a week, like you do your weightlifting progressions and let's say it's 100 reps and there's 150 wall balls on Monday, so you're at 250 reps and there's 45 thrusters with Fran on Friday. The total rep count on your structure becomes very high. You're doing a lot of just training. You're doing endurance training, mechanical stress, accessory work. So it's very hard to just sustain also max effort strength
And
training.
Kyle was specifically saying, especially during competition time.
Yeah,
or leading
where
up to-
sport-specific volume is extremely high. So you might be doing the example that Max gave. The volumes for, especially for an elite athlete, would be even higher than what he just cited. And you want to add some max effort deadlift pulls on top of that. Like,
it's just tough. Like,
Yeah.
so if you're in one of those high volume training cycles, you might say, all right, we're going to take the bet that snatch, clean, and jerk and the derivatives are the most important thing that we need to train. I think right now, CrossFit as a collective community has agreed that's the most important strength quality to train in the sport. So you put most of your priority buckets on that, but you still need to get better at back squat, front squat, strict press, but it's hard to do all of that in a progressive format. The body just has limits when you're doing 5 Metcons and 3 endurance pieces and accessory
drugs.
work.
Yeah, for real.
And no drugs, yeah. That's actually, ironically, that's a big thing we talked about. I had to, in chapter 1, I was like, you know what? When I was growing up and I was listening to all of these strength people, none of them addressed the fact that a lot of them are on $500 to $3,000 a month of performance enhancing drugs to sustain these programs and to sustain
that's all they're
these.
doing. They don't have a real job.
Yeah, no job and also no other training. No, like the Westside guys were going in 4 days a week to like get better at powerlifting. They weren't doing running progressions or going playing pickup as far as I know, pickup basketball.
guys
they were
did
definitely not doing running progressions.
or doing gymnastics.
Yeah, so we had a whole section which I called the pink elephant.
Yes, you did.
It's supposed to be the elephant in the room, but I guess I got it confused with the psychological exercise that says don't talk about the pink elephant, and then or don't think about the pink elephant, and people think about the pink elephant.
Somehow Habdo and I just like it whooshed
just
us.
went over all of our heads.
Whooshed us so bad.
But anyway, I did bring.
You said it, and I was just like, all right, well, maybe that's a thing. I've heard of a white elephant, but I've never heard of a pink elephant. Maybe it's just something I don't know.
Yeah, so if you take the
My
course
bad.
and you see that, now you know. But we had to talk about that a lot because over time, I had to, the Bruce Lee quote, like, take what is useful, discard what isn't, and then make it your own or whatever the actual quote is. That's what I feel like I've learned over the last decade is I've learned from all of those people. But Greg Everett was primarily building his methods for expression of snatch and clean and jerk on national and world stages in the sport of weightlifting. Mark Ripito was expressing strength through the power lifts. You go Charles Poliquin, there was some sport performance, mostly track and field, hockey, huge influence in bodybuilding. So they were building their methods with these specific outcomes with this specific group of very focused, young, sometimes on drug athletes. And those methods then don't actually apply as well when you have people that are trying to do it all. So in that realm, this is why this method is something that I think is a method that could be very important addition to a lot of CrossFitters training program, because it's a type of strength that you can balance with the other things that you're doing pretty well. Whereas running a weightlifting progression and a plyometric progression and a deadlift progression and all of those things simultaneously while also doing metcons and conditioning work, I've seen breaks a lot of people. Like, a lot of people then can't sustain it, and then they start to figure out like, oh, this is what I like to do, or I'm not going to be competitive anymore. Whereas if you're kind of on the front end of it and you're thinking about a little bit more longevity in the process, you can use a method like this to save your joints when, you know, the cycles get really stressful and really high volume. And also, if you're a more trained athlete, you're past the intermediate, past the advanced phase, you're not able to PR, you have a sticking point that keeps showing up. It can just be a cool method to put in, and maybe you could ride a hype cycle to get a 5-10 pound PR in a late period of your training. So that's why I thought it could be a cool thing to just add to people.
It's interesting. Each of the methods here. So it's like the overcoming isometrics is like, you're talking about it as a sustainability method. It also can help people break plateaus and things like that, but it's really something that gives people longevity. Habdo was talking about plyometrics. That's a tool that builds people's performance ceiling, like just straight up raises their performance ceiling. And I was talking about bands and chains, which is something just to break through plateaus. You know, you've tried all the different strength cycles and you can't really add to your 1RMs. That's where you go. So each one of these has a really different application. But I think it's interesting that you approach the sustainability, the performance ceiling, and I went on the can't get stronger sticking point.
Yeah. On a different note, there's something in common here, is that they all are kind of the unsexy / inconvenient thing. And that's probably, like I said earlier, plays a large part in why they're probably underutilized, to our whole point. So then it becomes on us, and I think we did a good job in this episode, but to continue to do is try to help people understand the why and why they should be focusing on that.
Yeah, the why, and also I guess it is the why. I was thinking, and also the how, because I think like in the plyometrics, how to do it really influences.
I mean, how to do it for all three methods.
Yeah.
It's really about how you do it and like how effective it will be. But it is the why, because like if you don't have the why,
yeah, because the buy-in's not quite
exactly.
there.
Yeah,
like,
you don't
want to overcome it being
Exactly.
unsexy, to want to overcome that it's going to be annoying to set up all this stuff in a gym. That's, you know, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah. And then I'd also put out as a caveat, like, these are 3 methods that we just laid out. In the course, there's way more of them.
26
total methods.
Counted them up yesterday.
Oh, nice. So you were prepared with the actual number.
Nice.
I think, and we talk about this philosophically in the course, like, I think a good strength program is one of the things that makes that is somebody's adherence to it. So these are potentially annoying or not sexy methods or whatever you're going to do. If you're trying to get stronger, it has to be a consistent thing that you stick to over a long period of time. If you're using one of these methods, put it in for a 4 or 12-week training cycle, but you have to stick to doing what you're doing on a regular basis and develop that level of consistency. A coach having access to more methods, I think, has the ability to help athletes stay engaged, progress for longer, keep getting stronger when they're injured. So I think from a practical coaching standpoint, learning these first just intellectually, then doing them and going through cycles of being like, oh, what does this do to me? How does this feel? How am I able to generate force after 4 or 8 weeks? Will give you a practical context for then prescribing them. And then when you start prescribing them, you'll start to be like, oh, this is where this is really useful. This is where this is really helpful. So sometimes this boring, hard work, I get made fun of by all of my athletes that I make them do movement work and I put them back in on-ramp, and my programs are sometimes annoying. However, it gets training results. I mean, people have been at a top level for many, many years and for many, many different types of athletes. And I think a lot of it is attributed to having researched and built a collective systematic approach that has a lot of variance to play with, as opposed to only having, oh, I'm really good at writing weightlifting progressions and this is my lane. It's great if you're a weightlifting coach, but if you're a CrossFit coach or you're trying to coach sport performance, having access to those other methods can just be super, super, super beneficial to your career.
And real quick, tell me so like I said earlier, we're going to put these 3 methods onto a page, and then you guys listening will be able to go sign up and watch them all for free. What are they to expect when they get on that page? Like, what's that going to look like?
Yeah. So I think we haven't built it entirely as of the filming of the podcast. We have the PDF that has all of the categories broken down with number of reps, number of sets, what movements you can choose with it, what type of athlete can be in it, the loads that you should be using it. And then we also have the manual subsections that go with that.
So with the course, there's the video content and there's a big ass manual y'all have made.
Yeah.
And so you're going to actually put
how many pages?
280.
Yeah. So
280.
it basically like our version of a training
you're going to
textbook.
put whatever
strength.
sections we picked, you're going to just put the manual parts in there.
Yeah.
Basically the manual parts, like what you'll get on the website, it's an explanation of like what it is, who you use it with. Like that's like a big chunk of it. And then we've got like the details, right? That like Max kind of went through. But I think where the real value is we spent a bunch of time and a bunch of page capital, a bunch of words kind of going into like the considerations that you should take. Where does this belong in a season? Where does this belong in a session? Where, you know, what types of athletes does this work really well with? What types of athletes should you avoid doing this with? Like we went into detail with those kinds of things. And I think that's not given. Like I read Louie's, Westside book I went back through it again for this. And like, he talks about how to use it for elite power lifters, but not like who you shouldn't use some of those methods for. And I think we really spent a lot of time.
Be fair to him. He didn't give a fuck about anybody else.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Right. But we do, right?
Yes,
we do care about that. So I think we spent a lot of time going into that, and that's all provided in there as well.
And then the videos. So like I went through this little demo, like with my hands joking around about, or not joking, but explaining how the weight changes when you're doing bands and chains and what that's used for as an actual setup demo, explaining the weight, how the weight's calculated, how you prescribe it. And we did that actual demo in video on the training floor. So you'll get that video, which I think will be very helpful for people to understand the level of detail that's required. We showed overcoming isometrics. You showed actual examples. We went and we actually did plyometrics and showed how you could progress those plyometrics over time. So there'll be video demonstrations of all of the stuff that you see in parallel with the written content. And that can give you a framework for understanding like, oh, this is how we thought about educating and this is how we thought about creating our methods and here's how we explain things.
And hopefully they're a little bit more engaging than the video you were talking about that from the Westside. Thank you, David.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, Kyle. And now jump higher.
So I think, definitely go to, we'll put the link down here and maybe I'll flash it on the screen because we haven't built it yet, like Max says, but go check that out. My question is because I haven't gone through that. After I do that, the thing I would be wondering is like, okay, you say you have those 3 methods. You have, how many did you say, Kyle?
26.
Okay. If I do the course, my thing that I'm going to be wondering is like, how do I put it all together?
I mean, so that is literally, do you want to say
like
something?
You got all these methods. How do I weave them together so I don't fuck it up?
Yeah. So actually me and Kyle started the education. I did a little bit earlier, but 10 years ago, we went into the basement of my old house in Utah and we had polos on that we got made fun
I still have those.
We painted a whiteboard on the back of a wall and we
I remember these videos.
Yeah. And we taught strength, conditioning, assessment, all the things that you would potentially
I still hear
need to know.
great things about those courses, even though they're old as hell.
Yeah. I mean, we got a lot of good feedback. I think it provided a lot of value to the market, but I've learned over time. I went through that education, built a movement course, a second movement course, a third movement course, a mentorship program, a second mentorship program,
The classroom.
And what we realize over time is that people first before they start to get into the theoretical things that I sometimes talk about. And maybe I didn't realize at the time that I had so much experience, and I didn't realize that I was talking above a level of somebody first getting in. But before you give somebody a lot of the nuanced detail, you need to give them a little bit of theory, and then everything else needs to be a practical system. So when we built this course, chapter 1 is all theoretical. Like, we talk about drugs. We talk about how hypertrophy is created. We talk about strength and the difference between nervous system gains. We talk about aging. We talk about all of the theory of what is strength and what are we actually trying to go after. After that first chapter, it's literally all practical. It's how do you assess athletes' strength? We give multiple examples of actual athletes. Alexis is one of them, because people always want to see the world-class athlete, even though oftentimes they're not coaching those people. But we were like, okay, well, if they want to see what methods help elite athletes, Adam curated some of her training and put it into the manual for us. We showed it with Brooks, who's a more intermediate athlete, what his strength training program has looked like. We did it with a GPP athlete. We did it with Ryan, who's an endurance athlete. So we talked about strength within the context of endurance.
His training for his Boston Marathon. So it's not the entire training program, but it's
a strength component of it. Then we did a field sport athlete who's an athlete that's playing Division II football. So you can see how we select and choose all of from that assessment section. The next section is then how do you put these programs together, and starting like basic level, how you did your assessment. That assessment leads to you having a list of priorities to address each one of them.
Yeah, so for example, you might know from your assessment that someone needs speed work, and then you can go into the speed category and choose the methods like plyometrics
that we just talked
explosive training or PAP, or all the different things that we lay out for each of the categories. You also might find someone needs power training, and then we have a whole category on power training. You might find that someone needs power endurance, but one of the things we talk about is the sequencing. You can't train power endurance until you've built speed, strength, and endurance separately before you go try and train power. Like we've laid that out, so it's almost like a cookbook.
Yeah, so it is a recipe for writing strength training programs. You take that priority list, you lay it into a calendar type format. From that, you zoom in, you write your training days. That builds your base framework of training program. And then we talked about how you progress that over time. So I feel really proud about how we did this, where it's a very good balance of limiting the amount of theory and potential overcomplication. Like, you need to know some stuff. And so like the keep it simple, stupid is like, there's some truth to that, but you could also be overly simplified and not have a lot of knowledge, which I think is a risk. So we tried to find the balance point there of like, what's the minimum amount of theoretical stuff that we need to teach to make sure that people understand what we're doing after that. And then from there, we dug into real world, like this is how you write training programs. This is what they look like in the real world. Here are the problems that you're going to face, multiple case studies and other additional programs. So I think you should understand exactly how to put all of this stuff together if you take the full course.
Yeah.
The methods themselves will give you an idea of the methods, how we taught them, and just like what our educational style and framework looks like.
You know, I think the problem with the oversimplification of the keep it simple, stupid is that can lead people to like, okay, heavy squatting is the answer to every problem in strength training. And that leads people to narrowing their methods. And, you know, we talked about this, you know, earlier this week about how people are always harping on the fundamentals. The fundamentals are important, right? I'm not going to sit here and tell you that the fundamentals aren't important, but the reality is that just doing heavy squats will make you stronger, but it won't make you better at sport.
Yeah.
And that I think is maybe one of the biggest takeaways that we've got in the entire manual, separate from you actually having a framework and a system for coaching your clients.
I was going to say, we talked about this, that like CrossFit came out and then like originally just like broke all the rules on what strength and conditioning training could look like. Cause it was like, oh, we have to keep everything separate because of the transference effect. But now it's like, well, you can probably do a lot more together and layer things on than you originally thought. So I think people took that as like, well, I don't need to learn anything now. I can just do whatever I want because people are just going to get better.
Yeah.
And
there's fallen into the constant varied or just intensity.
Yeah.
Like you're doing it hard and it's varied, so it's good.
Right. Exactly. And it's like, there might be some truth to that, but you need to learn the rules in order to break the rules.
Bam, there you go.
Yeah. I mean, like Kyle and I talked about this. It's like, if there's just no framework and there's just no rules, you can't ever know like what you're doing is right or wrong, and you can't know like how to break it and what is an appropriate break versus what's not an appropriate break.
And you can't evaluate it
For sure.
right? If there's no framework for saying like, all right, this is what even just in that model, I think I would always lend towards planned variance.
Sure.
Like in our progressions I talked about, we talked specifically about CrossFit training programs, and they're very different. When you go back and you look at some of these old methods in weightlifting, powerlifting, the things that have tested time, they're very methodical, structured. Like it's almost like a written programming code where there's rules into it. Like if you hit this X, then you do that Y.
Yeah, it's an algorithm.
It's an algorithm, and it's very structured and linear. And that could be boring as shit for a lot of people. And I know for myself too, like I'd get into strength cycles and I'd want to do like 4 to 8 to 12 weeks of a certain one. And then I'd want to try something new. This then shifted to all variation and just like doing it whenever it comes up in training, doing it heavy, whatever. And I think my time playing in both worlds got me to like, oh, this middle ground is really the way. Like there is some variation and some truth to the fact that we need constant variation to stay healthy long-term and to learn new motor patterns and all of that stuff. But you also need progressive overloaded linear planning or undulating planning or some sort of framework to be able to continue to progress people moving forward.
Like dynamic periodization.
Oh yeah. Another concept.
We'll save that for the course though.
Yeah.
All right.
All right, Chris, you got any other questions?
Sure don't. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Peace.
Hit this? Yep.